Hello, and welcome to a short presentation on the future of religion post COVID-19. My name is Professor Dr. Iqbal Akhtar at Florida International University in Miami, in the United States. I'm the director of the Western Indian Ocean Studies program and an associate professor in the departments of Religious Studies and Politics and International Relations. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge Babasaheb Ambedkar Maratwada University in Aurangabad, the Vice Chancellor Wakte, Ms. Somani, Professor Natrekar, Professor Ambore, Professor Nagore, and Professor Pandya for taking the time and inviting me to present at this conference. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's wonderful to connect with my colleagues in India and other parts of the world through this international conference. So I wanted to begin by thinking about what are the political dimensions, because the political and economic dimensions play into this sort of response then by faith communities and understanding the future of religion in the post-COVID world. So the COVID sort of pandemic has created a global crisis in political authority, in economic connections, and also sort of human societies in terms of trying to come to terms with what this means. So one of the things that we've seen is there has been a retreat of democracy and egalitarian political thinking and the rise of authoritarianism. Of course, to some extent, this is understandable because in the times of crisis, people want security, they want assurance from leadership. But also, many authoritarian governments have taken this opportunity to impose very harsh measures in terms of sort of populations and sort of the control of their abilities to move. Also tracking sort of their movements using new cameras and technologies to be able to do that. And the question is, what does that mean in terms of people having a political say in their future and the regime that comes out of the pandemic sort of world? So one of the things that we've seen is that many governments and particularly international institutions have utterly failed. And I sit here in the United States, and we've seen the federal government especially completely collapse in terms of being able to provide a cohesive, coordinated response across society, and really local and state governments taking sort of much of the role in terms of dealing with the pandemic and sort of its aftermath. So thinking through then, it's sort of exposed not just sort of the failure of governments, but also international institutions. And that's sort of a larger issue, is thinking through what should international institutions look like. So the majority of our international institutions, like the United Nations, were created in the post-1945 World War II world, in which nation states were much stronger, sovereign, and were basically the chief actors in much of sort of international relations. And we saw that with the two world wars. Our world now looks substantially different. There are many more countries, independent countries. On top of that, we see many non-state actors that have very important roles to play. And most conflicts now are not necessarily between states, but within states. So there are power struggles, refugee populations that have increased within societies. And so the question is, what new international institutions, or how could international institutions be modified in order to deal with sort of this world, right, the 21st century, and sort of the new political ramifications of the society we live in. I think what it also does is it shows sort of the limitations of this idea of modernity, that societies in the developing world simply need to modernize to become like the West, and then that solves all of your problems. So that clearly didn't solve all of the problems in Europe and sort of North America, and other parts of the developed world. So really thinking through what does modernity mean? How do we engage with modernity and also keep aspects of traditional society? And to what extent does the idea of sort of Western modernity, is it what are the major limitations in terms of trying to organize society in societies in Africa and Asia? So one of the things that we've seen is that as governments have sort of failed to address the issues with people's lives in this pandemic, we've seen religious institutions and religion, especially rituals and sort of community that religion fosters, do a much better job of being able to provide people with not just social services, but also the psychological support in order to deal with the stress of the pandemic. And so the question then becomes sort of how do we create sort of new multicultural and multilateral institutions through sort of faith communities and other sort of social networks in order to sort of deal with this retreat of a globalized world. And of course, it's very clear that in society there have been major losers in terms of sort of globalization. And now I come to the economic sort of reality. So one of the things that we see, and this is sort of an analysis by The Economist magazine, is that we live now in the 90% economy. So kind of what our economy was before the pandemic, it's going to be 90% of that post-pandemic. And what does that mean for budgets? What does that mean for international institutions and aid? What does that mean for average people? I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is that for the first time this century, there's going to be an increase of global poverty. So especially those workers who are kind of left behind through globalization, the poorest workers, migrant workers, workers that don't have strong political protection in terms of their rights are going to suffer the most, right? Those daily wage earners. And the question is, how do we restructure the economy? How do we rethink um, that the economic structures that are in place that were driving sort of globalization? So there's this term globalization, basically an unraveling of global trade regimes from the World Trade Organization to sort of other organizations like the World Health Organization, really sort of an unraveling of cooperation as this new sort of order emerges, and particularly the new sort of superpower competition between China and the United States, and sort of what does that spell for much of the rest of the world. And we see this also in terms of course, world health responses. So sort of aid and efforts that were being taken to help eradicate major sort of diseases like polio, malaria, cholera, other things. I mean, to what extent are those development projects and those ways of helping the poorest in our society, how are they going to be affected by sort of the new economy? So coming to then religion and thinking through religion, we see that religion is also entering a new phase, what we could be called digital religion. So there are new rituals, new fellowships that can emerge sort of in the virtual space, and that's one of the things that has happened in much of the world, in the developed world especially, is that instruments like Zoom, YouTube, other sort of platforms are being used to connect believers to rituals that they're not able to attend in person. And the question is this a temporary phenomenon, or is this fundamentally going to change how people experience religion and then how it creates global networks? Because with the internet, then anyone around the world can connect ideas, identities to be shaped through sort of virtual religion. We've seen a major cancellation of major events like the Ratha Yatra and sort of the Hajj as well. And so, sort of, how do you cope, theologically speaking, ritually speaking, even in terms of religious law, in a situation where you're not able to connect? But also, what opportunities does that open up? So maybe people who are older, people who are sicker, now have access online to religious rituals and sort of fellowship that they never had in the past. So how is this going to change how we organize society? I think for many religious traditions, of course, there's some, sort of fringe groups that try to ignore the contagion and the pandemic, but we also see this with political groups. So in the United States, much of the Republican Party acts as if the pandemic is over and nothing is happening. And there are major sort of infection cases in places like Texas and Florida and other places. But I think by and large, most religious communities understand the challenge of the pandemic and are trying to figure out ways to mitigate, to incorporate millennia-old religious traditions into newer ways of sort of organizing and thinking. So I think that's something that we really need to sort of think through then. How do we create new ways of sort of connecting through these traditions, but also what are the principles of faith and faith traditions that can help us to recreate a better world? So what are some traditions of equality, justice, environmental preservation, and stewardship that could allow us to create or to build back better the world in which we are going to inhabit and our descendants are going to inhabit? So what the pandemic has helped us to do, it's helped to highlight fundamental imbalances that we as humanity have sort of imposed upon others and imposed upon the natural world. So we see structural inequalities like racism in the United States, especially with the protest of George Floyd and trying to push for social justice. It comes to the fore and something that was hidden in the past presidency. But it also, I think, for religious people, it helps you to sort of rethink what is the relationship between the creator sort of and creation, and I think that's a very important one. So we really want to think through to what extent does the pandemic force us to rethink and reconnect to who we are, to those that are important to us, how we order and structure our societies politically and economically. So what does that world order look like? Really rethinking sort of local, national, and international institutions. But also, I think it provides a unique opportunity to remove or sort of extricate yourself from existing patterns, not just of economic, political development, but also intellectual interaction. So is it possible that we can coordinate much more research and sort of intellectual dialogue between Africa and Asia rather than simply Asia and Europe? So what are sort of international organizations? How does a rising Asia, how is that going to rechange and refocus sort of the global economy and global politics? And to what extent can an inter-Asia dialogue, intellectual dialogue, sort of help to reshape sort of this new world order? Are there intellectual innovations that societies in Africa and Asia have the capacity to be able to develop and bring to the fore that actually could be models for sort of new types of development for the developed world? And I think as overall, one of the things that's very important for us to think about and to remember is that this is an inflection point in human history. It's a very important point in which the world order has kind of been thrown into chaos, but at the same time, through that chaos, there's actually the opportunity to change and to think through the type of world that we like. So I'll end here with chapter 8 from the Tao Te Ching, which kind of gives some inspiration, Asian inspiration, to think about how we should act in the world. So it says here that the people of the highest virtue are like water. Water benefits creation without any conflict, and it favors the low places shunned by the common people. In this it resembles the Tao. Live in harmony with the land, allow emotions to run deep, show benevolence in your dealings with others, speak with honesty, arrange things according to the proper order, manage according to your ability, act according to opportunity, without conflict. There is no animosity. So again, I wanted to thank you all for allowing me to present this very short presentation for your conference at the university on human predicament after COVID-19. Thank you to all the organizers, to the university, and to the participants for listening and for joining and for allowing me to present. I wish you all the best and hope to collaborate in the future.